In the last hour, we've had very possibly the most important interview in the history of the platform. Now, I say that because the exposure of the sabotage or intended sabotage of the government's educational objectives by senior public servants within the Ministry of Education, as contained in the Education and Training Amendment Bill number 2, is as much a breach of democratic intent and objective as I have seen in my life, and would clearly breach various sections of the coalition agreement that National has signed with both ACT and with New Zealand First, and how it would govern New Zealand over the next 3 years, in response to, obviously, the overwhelming view expressed at the last general election that we need to come back to a view that all New Zealanders are treated equal, should have equality of opportunity, and regardless of their ethnic, cultural, religious, whatever background they might have the opportunity to succeed, and are given that opportunity to do so, without favoritism being applied to any one particular group. The problem with favoritism is that by its very nature, it diminishes the opportunities of those who aren't favourites. So if you single out one particular ethnicity or culture, for example, and say they are especially deserving of attention, as the Education and Training Amendment Bill number 2 does, then by your very nature you are diminishing the other cultures and ethnicities that exist within the New Zealand education system. And that is, in part, what the Education and Training Amendment Bill number 2 is designed to do. You won't actually read about this bill in any of the mainstream media. It's the reason the platform exists. It's to highlight these particular assaults that are being conducted, the sabotage, no less, of our education system and of learning in this country. And this revolution that is proposed mostly by unelected bureaucrats at the end of the day, sitting in their Wellington Aeries, this revolution that they seek to impose upon the rest of us, without our knowledge or our particular awareness. And this is the latest example of that. Here is an act designed to make sure that every child, as the paramount objective of this legislation, is able to attain, quote unquote, their highest possible standard in educational achievement, and then it imposes a straitjacket of the Treaty of Waitangi upon that particular paramount aim. Now, the question you've got to ask is why? Why, when your aim is to ensure that every student at every school in this country is able to attain their highest possible standard in educational achievement, would you then say, yeah, but as long as the Treaty of Waitangi and various aspects of Maori culture and society have a prominence and preeminence in all of your quote-unquote plans, policies, teaching and learning programs? For they must now reflect, according to this particular piece of legislation, local tikanga Māori, Mātauranga Māori, and Te Ao Māori in all of your things, and they are compulsory. All right? This is not something that boards have the opportunity of trustees in New Zealand to opt out of, or is considered a nice to have, or is if it's relevant to you. It is compulsory and it must be attained by every board. Now, these two things are not compatible, obviously. But the other thing is, since 1877, the Education Act that made 3 things available to every child that has grown up subsequent in New Zealand, since 1877. The aim of the 1877 Act, probably one of the most enlightened pieces of legislation of the 19th century, was to ensure that education in this country for every child, I think it was over the age of 6 at the time, is free, compulsory, and secular. Now that last bit was really quite important. What it really meant was that the 19th century colonists in their wisdom, and it was wisdom, didn't want the old doctrinal disputes of the past or the belief systems of others to hold sway in the 19th century over all of the children of New Zealand. If you wanted to have a spiritual belief of the world, if you wanted to establish cultural practices, then that was something that was for your family. They weren't denied in any way, but they weren't encouraged nor made part of the curriculum that was part of compulsory, secular, and free education in this country. Flash forward to 2025, and ironically we're sabotaging the very principles upon which our education system was based by suggesting that Maori spiritualism should have a primacy over everything else. That Maori beliefs, holistic, this sort of belief that somehow there's a force out there that connects the whole universe, must be imbued into every teaching material, whether it's learning English literature, history, physics, chemistry, or any of the other fundamental learning or building blocks of knowledge in this country. And then to make sure that you do, this particular piece of legislation gives the Treaty of Waitangi primacy. Primacy. Everything else is judged against it. Boards must enact it. Presumably they now must go out and they must find what local tikanga is from local Maori representatives and take it out of the marae where it belongs and impose it, the only word, into every one of its schools and into every one of its lessons. That is what this Act does. It is a sabotage of those coalition agreements. It is a complete affront to how New Zealand voted at 2023. It is a denial of essentially every other ethnicity and culture in this country and their spiritual, cultural, or ethnic beliefs and value systems as well. Now, why would you suggest that the Treaty of Waitangi says you must now bring, and it's never said that, go and point out in the Maori version of the treaty or the English translation of the treaty, even if you were going to give that some sort of primacy, where now you've now got to imbue one form of religious belief, spiritualism, te ao Maori, into our school curriculum and system. And not only is it compulsory, the board has a statutory responsibility of this piece of legislation to ensure it happens on a daily basis in every subject and into everything the school does. Now, the Education and Training Amendment Bill number 2 has got no coverage that I have seen in mainstream media. Zero. When Education Minister Erica Stanford announced that she wanted to make sure that schools concentrated on the educational attainment of their children and that was the paramount objective, no reasonable person could have denied that this was of itself a good thing. And if you'd almost think to yourself, well, isn't that what schools are meant to have been doing over the last wee while? Well, here's a piece of legislation to ensure that it's compulsory and that they do. But then to have all of that philosophy, all of that primacy, all of that excellence, all of the desire to improve New Zealand educational standards and outcomes, sabotaged by one particular section, imposed into this legislation, is to deny not just that we are all New Zealanders and that we all have a vested interest in gaining an education that equips our children for not simply New Zealand, for Pete's sake, but for the international world in which our children will become solid international citizens. But it is also to say that we are now going to constrict education to this country to one particular viewpoint, and it must be incorporated in everything that that school does. It is the most appalling sabotage. It is the most egregious nonsense. It is the most, the singular, I guess, desire is to ensure that New Zealand isn't part of the Western world, that it doesn't become part of the international community, that it isn't producing students who can hold their head up high on any international stage anywhere, with the knowledge that they have the knowledge to be leaders in whatever particular field or enterprise that they might, or vocation that they might have joined. If this goes through, not only will it kill this government and its credibility stone dead, but it will also hold New Zealand back into a world that existed prior, ironically, to the 1877 Education Act. It will hinder educational achievement in this country. It will stop our kids from composing themselves on the international stage, and it will, as sure as hell, drive every intelligent person in their family to another land to seek an education and a lifestyle for their children that this country was determined to sabotage. Those are my thoughts this morning. What are yours?